So we looked at 11 different indicators since 2012. Every one of them points towards increasing insecurity in work. And it's the combined effect of it that I think is quite concerning. The fact that most of us no longer can count on a permanent full-time job and the security that comes with it.
Hello, my name is Jan Wisniewski and this is The Strife, a podcast to discuss issues in Australia with the long term in mind. In this episode, we're talking about work. Specifically, the jobs we have now, the jobs we'll have soon, and how the boundaries between employed and unemployed are beginning to blur. That's right, precarious employment. My guest today, Dr. Veronica Sheen, defines precarious employment as essentially a temporary arrangement between a worker and employer embodying a degree of uncertainty for the worker. And this form of work is on the way up. Based on her research for an upcoming chapter in a book compiled by German social researcher Peter Hermann, Dr. Sheen says, digital technologies have a major part to play in precarious work, but other factors related to government policy can't be counted out. So while the rise of the machines in our workplace gets us pretty worked up, it's worth thinking about the intentions behind these technologies and where work is headed. Here's my chat with Dr. Veronica Sheen. So I'll start with the most simple question to kick off things. What is precarious employment? And would you say that it is intrinsically a bad thing?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say, yes, I think it is intrinsically a bad thing. Now, we can separate out different forms of employment that are not, casual work is not necessarily a bad thing for, a teenager working at the local supermarket a few hours a week. But precarious employment, the way it's developed over the last 20 years, I think it is basically a bad thing for most people. The central problem is that the economy and society is still basically built around stability and security. And with the very high rates of precarious employment now, you can't actually fulfill your social and economic obligations. So how do you, the simple day-to-day problems of being able to rent a house or buy a house or bring up children, give them a sound education, stable upbringing, just the whole suite of life depends on security and stability, and employment is absolutely intrinsic to that. So I do believe that precarious employment is a bad thing, and that's not to say that casual jobs, we all had them as teenagers or even beyond as students. Yeah. That's one thing, but the extent, the range of precarious employment as it is now in the economy and in the labour force is intrinsically a bad thing. And
outside of casual employment, are there other forms of insecure or precarious employment?
Yes. Look, casual employment as it is now in Australia has remained about 25% of employees, people employed for the last 20 years. It actually hasn't changed that much.
Okay.
But there has been a great increase in other sorts of precarious employment, particularly contracting, subcontracting.
Yep.
You also have the rise of this so-called gig economy. It's actually quite a small proportion of employment, but it's still out there, and more people are relying on those sort of little jobs, Uber or Airtasker or in the United States called Amazon Mechanical Turk. So that's increasing, but really it is this contracting and subcontracting and what we call sham contracting. So
okay.
I live in the western suburbs of Melbourne, so a lot of factories and industries, what happened with a lot of workers was that they were permanent and then they were turned over to labour hire companies.
Yep. And
they're still doing the same jobs but under contract, so they don't know from year to year what their working arrangement is. And it's those developments that have been really very very troubling in the world of work for so many people.
Yeah. And just with the shoe on the other foot, what are the benefits of this sort of flexible workforce for employers?
Well, basically, Well, flexibility just goes with really very tight management of your overheads and your outputs, so you can calibrate your workforce to your day-to-day needs. What I've seen in my own research, that rise the on-demand economy. So really, work is very associated to what a business needs at a particular moment in time, but they sort of overlook some of the downsides. Employers can overlook some of the downsides of that, so they don't really build up skilled workforce, have people coming in and out. There's no real stability or commitment to doing well. People need to do a good job, but it is a shallowing out of the labour force, of the skills, so it's really bad for overall productivity in my view.
Mm-hmm. And internationally, would it be correct to say that Australia has a reasonably high level of casual work and, I guess, underemployment? And what are the forces that have led to this current level of precarious work?
Yeah. Well, Australia is, according to the OECD, world leader in precarious or insecure employment, and they've been saying so for some years that Australia is leading on that. Now, one of the things that is sort of very interesting around that is that, say, economies such as France, for instance, so Macron, they're trying to get a more flexible workforce because they think that the rigidities in the labour market in France are such that it's actually preventing more young people, especially going into getting good jobs. And I actually meet quite a lot of young French people, and they do complain about that. So look, there is a real tension there about flexibility and some of those old economies where there's a great rigidity in workforce. I suppose charters or but Australia is renowned for its flexibility. But the problem is that so many people are really seriously left out by that and caught in long-term precarious traps. So that is what's really happened in Australia. So in terms of the Australian Council of Trade Unions saying, based on OECD data saying that Australia has the third highest level of precarious employment in the OECD. The ACTU says that it constitutes around 40% of the workforce, and the Australia Institute is saying around 50% using various indices. I think they push those out, but I would, based on my research over a long period of time, my doctoral research, and so on, I would put it, a conservative estimate would be about 1/3 or 33% of the workforce in the areas. Yeah.
So that's obviously a reasonably high level of precarious work, and we've talked a little bit there about the kind of conditions this creates for people in the workforce. But what about the jobs that they're performing? Which jobs do you see as likely to grow in the next few decades?
We've heard so much and there's so much written and spoken about automation and robots and the big losses in jobs. But if you get with all the reading and even my understanding from my research, it's not just about that. It's how it's really strong growth, and what comes through so much new research, including from the United States Bureau of Labour Statistics. They're projecting out very strong growth in jobs in human services and in teaching and healthcare. And these are the really, really predicted to be the really strong growth areas. So certainly there is emerging, new forms of work in this with the emerging technologies.
Yeah.
But actually a lot of it is going to be in healthcare and human services and teaching and what is called labour intensive jobs. So trades work. In the United States, they talk a lot about people who involved in fitness and the sort of the wellness campaigns and so on. Those sort of areas are going to be the real growth areas of the future. So yes, strong jobs growth, but not necessarily related to computers and automation and we all coding and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, so that's obviously quite different to what I guess would be discussed prominently in the media when it comes to the workforce of the future, where we hear about advanced technologies, digitalisation, and how this would affect job numbers, basically, the loss of work. But in your research, you focused on two different phenomena, which are integration and fragmentation in the workforce.
Yes,
what exactly do these mean for Australian workers?
Well, this is what I believe are really the more important areas of how digitalisation is affecting work. So it is a question of how computers are becoming enmeshed in jobs, and there's such a powerful thing, and it's not really recognised. If you're an aged care worker or a nurse now, you often wear a device which monitors how long you are with a patient, okay? And you have set number of patients to see and a set number of minutes to do your job within and move on to the next one. And people don't understand that, but it's actually really stressful and difficult. And I've met people and spoken to people about it, and it's actually makes a lot of work really intensive. And in office jobs, people maybe having to wear monitors which actually so all their movements are monitored on all the time, so their productivity is constantly being controlled. Now, in my own research, people working in administration, their outputs on a hour-to-hour basis were constantly monitored in call centres, in warehouses. It's so intrinsically part of how so many jobs are now, but it just doesn't, in my view, doesn't get enough, isn't out there enough. So it's that integration of machines and computers into our working lives in so many ways. And then what can happen, what computers can and automation and the whole digitalisation can facilitate is more breaking up of jobs. So in the past, we like to think of a particular job. The receptionist might be, whatever, answering phone calls, making coffee, writing, typing up notes or something. But what digitalisation facilitates is breaking up of jobs into little bits and, contracting them out, putting them on into the gig economy, what I consider fragmentation of work. So that is the other big thing that is happening too, and that doesn't get enough airplay either. And those are the much more critical things that are happening about rather than job loss. It's actually how digitalisation affecting how jobs are done and the structure of work and employment. What's called taskification, that's where the gig economies are. So these gigs like Airtasker and Upwork are so good that they can break jobs down into little bits and send them out to whoever people compete to do them. So that's a really important part of what's happening now.
So another topic which you have brought up in your research is the influence of the government in contributing to increased precarious work. I think you've mentioned things like austerity measures coming from the government, punitive social welfare conditions, but also the nature of work being done by people in public positions. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Look, this was something certainly a very strong part of my own research. My doctoral research was a number of people who had good jobs in the past in the public sector and had lost them. And the thing is that so much work in the public sector is contracted out or outsourced now. This was a very big theme. The Australian Council of Trade Unions had a big inquiry into precarious, insecure work in 2012, headed by former Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, and that was a really important part of their findings, was that that old source of good jobs in government had really been fractured and broken down so much, and yeah, it was exactly what I found too. So yeah, governments are very, very tough-minded now around employment, and they try and make as much employment as minimise their core workforce, contract out as much as they can. And I just want to give a figure around that, because I think it is really important. A couple of years ago, the Commonwealth Government advertised they had 1,250 permanent jobs in organisations like Centrelink and Medicare and so on. So there was 1,250 jobs, and they had 41,000 applicants. Now, the thing it was, if you had to actually be working in the public sector already to even apply for those. So that just gives you so they're mainly just casual and contract workers who were trying to get a permanent job. So that was just shows massive level of precarious work in the public sector. And that's part of austerity that, they're trying to minimise costs. We still have all the fiscal pressures, and there's so much politicians always on about, budget balance and so on. The cost is being borne by so many people in the public sector. And it's also really serious in where the jobs growth is going to be. So in healthcare and in education, so many jobs are contract work, and having been working, in the in universities, I've seen. Well, it's what I've lived, And then the other part of it is social policy. So if you're receiving a New Start and unemployment payment, you're required to take any job at all that's suitable. So you're not allowed to forego on precarious work. You have to take it. So that actually promotes the growth of precarious work, and that's important part of what's happening now too. There's the really tough social welfare requirements around job take up on anything.
Okay, so if somebody is receiving an unemployment benefit and they're offered a role that is not full time, casual contract, they're obliged to take that role.
Yes, they are.
Okay. And just something that you mentioned earlier, in Australia, what would you said that for the last 25 years, we've had a similar level of casual work.
Yeah.
How often do people in casual roles then find themselves promoted to part-time or a full-time contract?
That's a really interesting question. And
or are there barriers in place that prevent that from happening?
Yes. Well, I've in the paper that I've been writing for a German publication recently, and in my own research, some of the longitudinal studies. So there's the household income and labour dynamics study run by the Melbourne Institute. So it's a very large. I think there's 17,000 participants been running since the year 2000. Very good. Yeah. Paper that was written a few years ago in 2013 by a researcher said that actually the capacity to get out of casual jobs, especially if you're an older worker and you're a woman, are quite limited. And so there's a lot of just recycling or staying in a precarious job for a very long term. And in my own research, there are people who've been in their casual jobs for years on end. Also cycling back into unemployment or out of the workforce. So this old idea that you just get a casual job and then move on to a better job is increasingly just not how things work anymore, because there simply aren't the full-time permanent jobs there to absorb those casual workers anymore.
Yeah. So it seems quite obvious that there's been a degradation of, I guess, what we'd call the traditional rights of workers. And traditionally, these rights have been fought for by the trade unions, which you mentioned. How can unions assist a fragmented workforce?
Well, they do need to really find their ways into the casual or precarious workforces, but that is very difficult. And, my own research, a lot of the people just, they're not strongly engaged enough, and they don't earn enough to be involved in their unions. So the unions have to work much harder at involving and reaching out and representing those workers. So that's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
They also need to work much more strongly with unemployed workers. Now in Australia, we've got a new Australian Unemployed Workers Union, which I think is doing a really great job in trying to get past this impasse that social welfare is in, where people are required to take on any precarious job. But the unemployed are part of the workforce, and increasingly, what's really important conceptual thing to get is that a lot of this old idea of employed unemployed is increasingly irrelevant. And what's really important to understand is that this is a very grey area now. So unemployed, employed, unemployed, as we know, being defined as employed, maybe just defined as employed for 1 hour a week, which is absurd. So it's a very grey area, but the system still operates around these loose, inexact definitions of what constitutes employed and unemployed, and it must really work past that. And unions need to take that on and really accept that unemployed people are part of the workforce too, and represent them much more substantially than they do.
Okay, and the new union that's been set up for the unemployed workers, you've seen some positive signs in that area?
Well, I think it's really tough. I mean, the government, both Labor and the coalition, are they just sort of really haven't given much, really, made anything easier around social welfare conditions. But they've just got to fight, and even if it takes years, well, the fight's got to be done. Got to be had. That's all there is to it. And unions have got to be part of that.
Yeah. So we're seeing pressures from the private sector and the government, the public sector, that are contributing to a more precarious workforce in Australia. You see more insecure employment in Australia going forward. Perhaps in an attempt to finish up on a slightly positive note, could you outline your ideal vision for the future of work, something that we could work towards?
Well, personally, and what I think is that government jobs, especially with the growth in healthcare and aged care services and education, a decent funding for those services and really secure jobs in those areas would be a good start. And I also believe, and based on my own research, that if government actually behaved and gave good conditions, that actually would have an effect on the private sector. Would it be leadership? But also, people would have actual genuine choices about the work that they have, so that they can actually make a choice to get a good job in government and tell the private sector to stick it. Yeah. And my own view is that governments can have a really strong leadership role in creating secure jobs, and the jobs should be secure. I mean, healthcare and social assistance and the education and training areas, that is just absolutely crucial to the economy and to our society, and people should have secure jobs in these areas. Simple.
Yeah.
Simple.
And how would you change maybe the welfare system a little bit as well?
Yes, and then having a social welfare system that people did have the choice not to accept insecure jobs. Now, there is a great debate at the moment about universal basic income, and sort of get it, but I have concerns about it that it could actually mean people are. I'm just really concerned about the UBI with its potential to create significant divisions in society,
Yeah.
actually fostering more inequality. But I think that revamping the social welfare system, making unemployment payments decent, making the requirements less punitive, and a real focus on getting people decent jobs rather than just having to accept precarious jobs would be actually beneficial. That's not to say the UBI. I think it's maybe will come of age in years to come, but at the moment, I think there's a lot of risks in it involved.
Yeah. It's not the first step to take, is that what you're saying, in terms of reform of the welfare state?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks very much for answering my questions today, Veronica. Was there anything that you wanted to finish on, or anything you wanted to mention?
Well, I think we've did a pretty good job in covering everything, so we'll leave it at that.
Perfect. So there you go. Something to look forward to. Or, if you're not too happy about the direction we're headed, something to start talking about and fighting against. Once again, that was Dr. Veronica Sheen providing some insight into her research on precarious employment. The song you're about to hear is by Adelaide band Workhorse. You might know the members of Workhorse from some of your other favourite Adelaide bands, but if not, this is a perfect chance to get acquainted. Thanks as always for listening.